Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. For months, almost a year actually, the refrain has sounded, Russia hacked the election. Russia colluded with Donald Trump. It was unprecedented behavior, treasonous, really. Heard that night after night on this show. We've been told we need a massive, semi-permanent investigation to expose all these crimes. We might even need to nullify a presidential election. Okay, so let's say that Russia did hack the election. What would that look like? A few $1,000s spent on lame, ineffective Facebook ads? Probably not. Instead, it might look a lot like what was actually going on for years at the Podesta Group, the Democratic lobbying firm co-founded by Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. According to a source we spoke to who worked there at the Podesta Group for years, the company received huge sums of money from a pro-Russia shell group in order to bolster Russia's interests in Washington, all without declaring itself the agent of a foreign power, which it demonstrably was. Election hacking might also look like the infamous and fraudulent Trump dossier, which was compiled in 2016 and then released this past January by BuzzFeed as a laughably stupid news story. Much of the information in that dossier came from Russian sources with ties to the Kremlin. Who paid for this? Well, at one point, funding came from the Democratic National Committee, Hillary Clinton's campaign, possibly even the FBI. So let's say you were looking for a smoking gun in this Russia story, and many are looking for that smoking gun. We now have evidence that Democrats literally paid money for Russian intelligence, as well as proof that the top Democratic lobbying firm in Washington was getting rich by advancing Russian interests. Collusion? If that's not collusion, what is collusion? We put a lot of calls out today, and very few Democratic lawmakers were interested in talking about this at all. The rare exception was Brad Sherman of California, the honorable exception, and he joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you. I'm here to talk about the tax bill.
The tax bill. Well, unfortunately,
I mean, this is a job-killing, deficit-exploding tax bill, which is the real story, the real vote in Congress.
Let me just cut you off.
I know you can't defend it.
Before you go, we don't have a tax bill. We have no idea what the details are.
We have the Trump-proposed 12-page document.
We have literally nothing.
We have a 12-page document, which is pretty long.
And then it'll get to the Senate, and it will become something completely different. So I would love to debate that because I think it's really interesting, and we may not even disagree on parts of it. But I want to ask you about the story that we've spent the last year talking about.
You can't defend the Trump tax proposal.
This is clever, and I will have you on any day to talk about an actual tax bill.
No, you won't. I've been trying to get on your show to talk about economics again and again and again, and you only have me on to talk about nonsense.
Spare me. Nonsense. And then, really, the nonsense that the Democratic Party has hijacked the workings of Washington for the last year over this Trump story, or the Russia story, and for you to say
you've got no defense for Trump's impeachment. The man has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, and your only defense is, well, Hillary did too.
Okay.
You can't impeach a private citizen and say that's a reason not to impeach a president who's guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. I am.
I think you've jumped off the rails a little bit. Let me ask you some factual questions and see how you do with those. You can put the bumper stickers away. What do you make of the fact that the Podesta Group, with whom I know you're personally familiar, was taking money from Russian interests to advance those interests in Washington?
I'd like to take a look at it, but it's irrelevant to whether we should impeach Donald Trump. He is guilty of obstruction of justice.
But you're not even going to engage on that question? What do you make of the fact that the Democratic National Committee, from whom I assume you take money, gave money to the people who wrote the Trump dossier, whose information came from Kremlin-connected sources? Does that bother you? That they used Russian intelligence in the course of this?
That dossier was funded first and foremost by Trump's Republican opponents.
Correct.
There is nothing in that dossier.
Whose names we don't know.
Correct. There is nothing in that dossier that appears to be stolen information. What we have here...
Well, first of all, you don't know that. And
I don't know whether there are Martians who are landing on the planet.
Of that, but we know for a fact, because it's been conceded, that information, some of it came from sources around Vladimir Putin.
This is a document that had no effect until
that's your excuse. So I'm just a simple question.
No.
Look,
I don't need an excuse because whether we impeach the character of a private citizen is an irrelevancy. Whether we impeach a president who is guilty of obstruction of justice
Wait, but I'm talking, hold on, slow down.
Okay, this had no effect on the election.
The presidential election, well, you don't know if it had an effect on the election or not.
How can you affect an election by a document that's released 3 months after the election?
Because the information, the document was run in BuzzFeed. The information went to the Hillary Clinton campaign.
And information that was of absolutely no use. Scurrilous rumors about the sex life of Donald Trump that were not released.
I'm a little bit surprised that you have spent the last year telling us that Trump has colluded in some way with the Russian government and that he has committed, in effect, treason, which is basically what you've been arguing.
I don't accuse him of treason. I accuse him of obstruction of justice. Take a look at Section 1512 of the felony code.
But you're not bothered by the fact.
He's committed obstruction of justice 3 times. It's not the crime. It's the cover-up.
Right.
We learned that with Watergate, and we learned that. And Richard Nixon could not have stayed in office.
Richard Nixon?
Richard Nixon could not have stayed.
I'm asking you a really simple question about the news of today, which is...
No, the news of today is this tax bill that's going to cost us millions of jobs.
You don't know what's
That's what happened.
The tax bill.
We do have the Trump tax proposal that you can't defend, but is the official and most significant economic document released by the Trump administration in 10 months.
I think I'm searching back in my mental files to recall an example of greater disingenuousness than the one I'm witnessing now. You went bananas over the Donald Trump Jr. meeting. Oh, he met with a Russian. This is, the end of times.
I never said that.
Yes,
you got me confused with another good-looking bald guy.
No, I don't. You are the guy who did that. I'll get the tape.
It's the obstruction of justice, and I've identified
telling us why it was so poisonous to American democracy for Trump or his campaign to have any contact with the Russians.
No, my
now we have evidence that the Democratic campaign was doing it.
You've got me confused with some other good-looking bald guy.
I follow this for a living. But let me ask you
I follow this for a living, too. And I know that this is the most significant economic document released by the Trump administration. You can't defend it, and you want to talk about nonsense.
I'm sorry, let me ask you.
You want to talk about why Hillary Clinton is bad instead of why Donald Trump should be impeached.
You filed articles of impeachment
for obstruction of justice
the day after that story about Trump's son broke. That's the day that you. Oh, that was just an accident. Okay, right. This is look.
I circulated those articles of impeachment a month before the date you identified.
Okay, so let me ask you. It was July 12th. Let me ask you a simple question. Trump's connections to Russia, you have consistently argued, are a big deal. It's not a fake story.
No, I have consistently argued that his obstruction of justice last February, May, and July are violations of Section 1512 of our felony code. Obstruction of justice applies whether there was collusion or not.
It has nothing to do. So your entire party has spent the last year telling us this is the most important thing that has ever happened. We now have evidence that the charges you are making against Trump apply to your own party and your own candidate, and you're ignoring it, and you're throwing this fit on my set telling me, oh, it's not a big deal. Why do you want to talk about the tax bill?
May and July. Obstruction of justice 3 times, violation of Section 1512.
You're not even, you know what? I honestly, it's hard for me to believe, given everything you've said in the last year, that you're putting on this performance now. Why don't you just say, look, what Hillary did, her campaign paying for intelligence from the Russians, that was bad, but she's not president. Let's move on. You won't even say that.
I don't know what Hillary did, except she
actually
did opposition
we do know.
Research.
What do you mean we don't know? We know exactly what she did. They admitted it this week.
They admitted that they paid for opposition research. Every campaign
of course they all do.
For opposition research.
That comes from the Russians. This dossier came from the Russians.
No, this dossier came from a research firm and a British individual.
Really? And who is the British individual? Do you know?
I believe his name is Mr. Steele.
Yeah. And why was he hired? Because he was the head of the Russia desk at MI6. He was a Russia expert, and the information was about Trump's ties to Russia. They got this information from the Russians, and they paid, in effect, Russian sources for it.
They paid a man to prepare a memo.
Quick, does it bother you? Does that bother you at all?
Not particularly.
Does it bother you? Has the Podesta Group ever lobbied you for anything?
I believe they have. I believe they've also. I believe you're also a friend of Tony.
I'm not a friend of him, and he's never lobbied me. I'm not a sitting.
Well, you're not a member of Congress, yes.
And I'm not a friend of Tony Podesta's. But does it bother you that Tony Podesta took money with Paul Manafort from the Russians to carry their water in Washington?
Does it bother you that Paul Manafort was chair of Trump's campaign?
Yes, it does.
Well,
does it bother you that the Podesta firm was working on behalf of the Russians?
I would like to. If it was true, it would bother me.
It is true. I mean,
You're asserting it. A lot of things are asserted on this.
No, I'm not asserting it.
Okay.
It is factually
You're
true
saying that he failed to file a foreign agent's report.
You know, that's I believe that to be true. What I know is true is that they took money from Russian interests to represent those interests here in Washington.
Well,
and I think by your standards, that's wrong.
When you say Russian interests, if you mean private companies, that's different.
No, I mean I mean the Russian government. I mean the Russian government.
If he did it? Why don't you want to talk about impeaching a president? And your answer is, hey, there's this lobbyist in town that isn't any good.
Because the predicate for this impeachment is exactly the same behavior.
You haven't read my
articles
of impeachment are only a page and a half, and you haven't bothered to read them.
Actually, I have read them.
Then you know
and I think they're even more fatuous now than I did before, now that I know that there's no principle that undergirds them, that you're willing to excuse anything the Democrats do.
Justice is a crime. Yeah. It is a felony punishable by 20 years, up to 20 years.
Come back when you got a tax bill and you want to chat about it.
The tax bill's been released, and you can't defend it.
Yeah, right.